You're lying in bed. The room is dark. Your phone is face down. You're supposed to be sleeping. And then it starts. Maybe it's a conversation you wish you'd had. Maybe it's a version of your life that looks slightly or completely different from this one. Maybe it's a scenario so specific, so detailed that you visited it dozens of times. You know exactly how it goes. You know what you say. You know how the other person responds. None of it is real. All of it feels important. And if you've ever wondered, late at night, in the quiet, whether this is normal, whether everyone does this, whether there's something this habit is quietly revealing about you, the answer is more fascinating than you'd expect. Because here's what I find genuinely extraordinary about this behavior. It's not escapism. It's not a failure of discipline. It's not even really about sleep. It's your brain doing something deeply purposeful in the only moment of the day when nobody else is watching.
Here's what makes pre-sleep imagination so psychologically rich and so worth understanding. Most people experience this. The surveys consistently show it. Somewhere between 60 and 96% of adults report having elaborate mental scenarios before sleep, and yet almost nobody talks about it. It lives in that particular category of human experience that feels simultaneously universal and deeply private, like everyone does it and nobody mentions it. And if you've always done this, if the moment the lights go out, your mind starts building worlds, you don't need to explain or justify it. This isn't a quirk. This isn't immaturity. This is one of the most honest things your brain does all day. But here's where it gets interesting and complicated. Because the scenarios people build before sleep tend to fall into a few very distinct patterns. Some people rehearse. They replay conversations, reimagine confrontations, practice what they'll say tomorrow to the person they couldn't find the words for today. Some people escape. They build lives that look nothing like their current one. Different jobs, different cities, different versions of themselves entirely. Some people process. They return to the same painful memory, the same unresolved moment, the same relationship, circling it like a plane that can't quite land. Think about the person who replays the same argument every night, not because they enjoy it, but because some part of their brain hasn't finished with it yet. Or the one who builds an entire alternate career in their head before sleep, vivid, detailed, emotionally satisfying, and wakes up to an alarm for a job that feels like a costume. Or, and this is the one that gets complicated, the person whose pre-sleep scenarios are the only place they feel fully themselves, where the overthinking finally stops and something truer takes over. That's not a problem to be fixed. That's a signal worth listening to. And the psychology behind what that signal is actually saying, that's what nobody ever explains properly. So, what is your brain actually doing when it builds these worlds? Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. The moments just before sleep, what neuroscientists call the hypnagogic state, are unlike any other period in your waking day. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logic, judgment, and social performance, begins to quiet down. And what emerges when the editor goes offline is something much rawer, much more honest. Researchers at Harvard studying the default mode network, the brain's resting state system, found something that reframes this entirely. When the brain is relieved of external demands, it doesn't go blank. It immediately begins processing unresolved emotional material, relationships, desires, fears, identity questions, through narrative and imagery. What that means for you is this. The scenarios you build before sleep aren't distractions from your real thoughts. They are your real thoughts finally getting airtime. Be honest, have you ever woken up and realized that what you imagined the night before told you something true about what you actually want? That's not coincidence. That's the brain doing its most honest work in the only window where loss aversion, social anxiety, and self-censorship aren't running interference. And here's the part most people don't realize. The content of the scenarios, what you imagine, who's in it, what you're doing, is not random.
It's a direct map of your unmet needs. Psychologist Abraham Maslow identified a hierarchy of fundamental human needs: belonging, esteem, autonomy, self-actualization. The scenarios people build before sleep almost always cluster around whichever of those needs is currently most unmet. The person imagining deep connection is often profoundly lonely. The person imagining recognition is often invisible in their daily life. The person imagining a completely different existence is often someone whose actual life has drifted furthest from what they'd choose if they felt free to.
So, how do you actually use this instead of just experiencing it passively every night? Not by stopping it, not by filling the silence with podcasts until you pass out, but by learning to read what your pre-sleep mind is telling you and then deciding consciously what to do with that information. Start here. Ask yourself this: what do I imagine most often, and what does the person in that scenario have that I don't have right now? Not what the scenario looks like, what it contains: freedom, recognition, connection, safety, a version of yourself you haven't become yet. This is needs identification mapping, a core technique in humanistic psychotherapy rooted in Maslow's work and developed further by Carl Rogers at the University of Chicago. When you identify the need underneath the scenario rather than just experiencing the scenario, something shifts. The brain stops using the imagination as a pressure valve, releasing tension without resolution, and starts using it as a compass. You're not just escaping into a fantasy anymore, you're reading a map. In your daily life, this sounds like spending 5 minutes after waking writing down the emotional quality of what you imagined. Not the plot, the feeling, safety, excitement, being truly seen. Then asking, where in my actual life is this quality completely absent? The gap between that answer and your current reality is not an accusation, it's a direction. Now ask yourself this second question: am I visiting this scenario or am I living in it? There is a meaningful psychological difference between using imagination as a creative rehearsal space and using it as a substitute for a life you're not building. Psychologists call the latter maladaptive daydreaming, a pattern identified by researcher Eli Somer at the University of Haifa, where fantasy begins to function as avoidance rather than processing. The brain gets the emotional reward of the imagined life without the risk of pursuing the real one. The question isn't whether your scenarios are too vivid or too frequent. The question is whether imagining this makes me more likely to pursue something real or less. If your pre-sleep world makes you more creative, more emotionally regulated, more clear about what you want, that's your brain using imagination exactly as it was designed to. At night, this looks like letting the scenario play out fully without guilt. In the morning, this looks like asking what one small real-world action rhymes with what you imagined. If your pre-sleep world is the only place certain needs ever get met, if the imagined version of your life is consistently richer than the one you're living, that's not a problem with your imagination. That's your brain sending you a signal you've been hitting snooze on for a very long time. And the third question, the quietest one, and often the most important, is there's something I'm rehearsing in my head that I'm afraid to try in real life. This is mental contrasting with implementation intentions, developed by Gabriella Oettingen at NYU, and it's one of the most evidence-based bridges between imagination and action that psychology has produced. You take the scenario you keep returning to, identify the specific obstacle that exists between that scenario and your real life, and form one concrete if-then plan to address it. Not the whole scenario, one obstacle, one plan. At work, this sounds like, I keep imagining being respected for my ideas. The obstacle is that I never speak up in meetings, so if I'm in a meeting tomorrow, I will say one thing in the first 10 minutes. At home, this sounds like, I keep imagining a closer relationship with someone I've been distant from, so if I think of them this week, I will send one message instead of just imagining the conversation. Your imagination already knows what you want. The only question is whether you're willing to let it lead somewhere real. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this. The scenarios you build before sleep aren't a sign that your real life isn't enough. They're not evidence of immaturity or avoidance or an inability to be present. They are your mind being completely honest in the only moment of the day when it finally can be. When the performance is over, when the social mask comes off, when the version of you that exists for other people finally gets some rest, and the version that exists for you gets to speak. You weren't escaping. You weren't being weak. You were listening to the most uncensored part of yourself, the part that knows, before your waking mind will admit it, exactly what you need. The question now is whether you're willing to listen back. Drop a comment. What kind of scenarios do you build before sleep? Rehearsal, escape, or something else entirely? You don't have to share the details, just the shape of it.